And yet another article from our resident author and the White Zulu, Fiona Timms. And this is headed up Summer Days. I got out of bed, dressed in my shorts and a cool cotton top, and ran down the long passage and out through the wooden stable door. I padded along the back veranda and skidded into the big kitchen. Dodging Masango, who was frying eggs for my father, he swiped at me with his metal spatula. "Hamba, Puma! Go! Get out!" he muttered, almost absent-mindedly. This was more of a ritual than a threat, though. His way of discouraging us from getting underfoot was swiping food. As a result, we always waited for him to go off to enjoy his morning and afternoon breaks, when he'd sit on the kitchen steps and light up a massive joint, which he rolled from a sprinkling of boxer tobacco and a liberal application of his own home-grown dacha, all wrapped in newspaper, torn from a 3-day-old Natal witness, or pravda, as we called it. Over their nearly 70 years of living on the farm, neither of my parents ever learned to recognize the plant itself, and Dad only when he smelled the sweetest smoke it emanates. So Masango would have his 8-foot-high plants safely tucked in among the taller flowers in Mum's herbaceous border, tenderly cared for by her garden staff. After inhaling the entire joint, which would be the size of a butcher's sausage, it was so well filled, Masango would get up, retrieve his chef's hat from where he tossed it onto the woodpile near the biela, or boiler, and slightly red-eyed would go back into the kitchen and cook like a demon, producing the most delicious meals with lavish quantities of butter and cream. Serving bowls, though, would often develop chips and cracks, and a substantial amount broke, all of which mystified Mum, as she simply could fathom out how Masango could be so rough on her crockery, a lot of which had been carefully shipped from the Alphen in Constantia, which had been Mum's home as part of her trousseau. The practice of Masangos went on from the time I was born until my sons went to UCT in the early 1990s, and, on coming back to the farm for holidays, discovered this bounty of free prime weed. Justin would show great interest in his Goko's garden, asking her the names of various flowers way down at the furthest end of the garden, while Alistair stole back, hauled a single dacha plant out of Mum's border, and hurriedly stuffed the enormous plant in the boot of his car, having to break the long step into bits so it would fit in. I only heard about my son's nefarious practices about 30 years later, and Mum never twigged as to why her youngest grandson suddenly shown such an interest in gardening in his late teens. To their credit, the boys always took a few packs of boxer tobacco up to the farm, every time they went, to give to the unsuspecting Masango as gifts. As much smaller kids, we sneaked into the kitchen to pinch things out of the big fridge, such as raw bacon rinds, with which we caught the river crabs. I ran off to the nursery to find all 3 sisters already there, eating their mealy meal porridge. We'd much rather have had bacon and eggs like my father did, but that sort of breakfast was for grown-ups, although we nearly always had scrambled eggs for supper, because my mother could never think of anything else for Masango to cook us. Diane looked up at me as I sat down at the nursery table. She's 2 years older than I am. Her name is Diana, but we shortened it to Dine. My mother, Dorothea, but always known as Doffy, disapproved of our using nicknames, so Nicky for Nicolette and Dee or Fee were not allowed. Of course, once we were at boarding school, those abbreviations became de rigueur. But Dine seemed appropriate for some reason, and even our parents called her that. She was an inch or 2 taller than I was, although I'd recently shot up too, growing very quickly into a long-limbed, coltish, rather gangly child with skinny legs and bony knees. Her hair was dark brown, a shade lighter than mine, which was almost black. We two middle daughters had inherited our father's straight but shining dark hair, kept short by sporadic visits to the hairdresser in Moy River. We all had his long, straight nose, and my oldest sister and I had his green eyes too. Dine and Delia had acquired our mother's intensely deep blue eyes, but Delia was the only child to be blessed with our mother's luxuriant golden curls, until later, when she reached the age of 6, and to Mum's intense disappointment, her hair darkened to a mousy brown and straightened out so that it looked just like ours. "None of you turned out to look like your mother," was frequently said by various friends or relations with much more than a touch of dismay whenever they looked at the four of us, a self-conscious, defensive huddle of pre-adolescent girls. It was early December, and summer was in full swing after our usual brief spring, with good early rains having swollen the river to a manageable level. Later on, over the next 4 to 5 months, the water level would fluctuate. Most afternoons the skies would darken, and there'd be crackerjack thunderstorms with torrential rain and huge hailstones, turning the river into a roaring torrent, thundering and foaming over the rocks and sending up spray that turned to rainbows in the bright sunshine. The day, from a slightly misty start, had become sizzling hot, and cicadas, we call them Christmas beetles, since they always began singing at the beginning of our Christmas holidays in early summer, shrilled from every tree. Red-chested cuckoos repeated their "Beat me fro, beat me fro, beat me fro" refrain over and over again from the tallest gum trees which towered over the lawn at the back of the house. I sat down to join my sisters at the nursery breakfast table and poked disinterestedly at the skin of my congealing white mealie meal porridge in its blue and white striped corningware bowl. "What are we doing today?" It was the beginning of the long Christmas holidays, so we had no school for the next 6 weeks. Not that that affected Dine and me much, since we didn't go anyway, but dodged our hated governess to go off and play with the Zulu children. Our oldest sister had come back from the previous day from St. Anne's Prep, where she was a boarder, but we were already bored and at a loose end. I shrugged indifferently. "Let's go for a swim." "Can I come?" Delia looked at us expectantly, hoping as usual to be included in our daily activities. "No!" Dine and I both turned on her fiercely. I taunted, "You're too babyish." Her eyes filled with tears. She cried easily, making it too tempting for us to pass up any opportunity. "Please," she pleaded forlornly. A large teardrop rolled off her round pink cheek and plopped into her porridge. I don't know why she ever wanted to join in anything we did, as we always managed early on to drive her home, sobbing and stumbling, to tell on us to our mother or Evelina, and getting us into trouble when we eventually got home. "Oh, I be all," Evelina would say, clicking her tongue and shaking her head in exasperation. And, "You've got to be nice to your little sister." Our mother would rage at us both as we squirmed guiltily under her angry glare, with Delia's triumphant little face peering at us from behind her. "No, you'll only get us into trouble again," said Dine firmly, and we managed our breakfast noisily, scraping back our chairs on the wooden floor and clattering out on the nursery, ignoring Evelina's vain pleas for us to finish our porridge first. We'd go and scrounge some uputu and a masi from the servants' breakfast later on, and another favourite. These delicacies were a doorstop of bread squashed into a sausage shape with our grubby fingers and dipped into an enamel mug of their delicious strong coffee, which bubbled in a battered iron saucepan for hours on the biela, the closest word the Zulus could manage to describe the wood burner that heated the water in the kitchen, which we called the boiler. We padded out to the back veranda, followed by Delia at a cautious distance. She wasn't to be so easily brushed off, and we began to accumulate the equipment necessary for our swim. "I hate you!" I gave Delia a shove. This was always how we started negotiations. "Bloody swine!" She poked me in the ribs. "Umsimba konyoka." Snake shit. This was the worst swear word I knew. I pronounced it Umzimba Konyonga. Years later I learned that Umzimba Konyonga was a Zulu retort referring in a most insulting way to one's mother's private parts. I'd always wondered why Evelina gave a small horrified scream and aimed a gentle slap at the back of my bare legs every time I uttered it. We were negotiating a strategy, deciding on who would lead the procession down to the river. This happened every time. We'd change into our bathing costumes, a motley selection of styles, patterns, and colours. When our oldest sister got a new costume, her old one was then passed down to Dine, and then to me. By the time I got it, the garment was faded and slightly raggedy from sliding down the huge boulders in the river and being left out on the grass to dry in the baking sun. This had bleached what colours remained to a pale imitation of the original. To my disgust, Delia, being the youngest, always got a new costume, as mine was beyond repair by the time I'd outgrown it. To my delight, she was still wearing those horrible, shapeless, floral-patterned, bubble-type stretchy creations that only babies wore. I could jeer at her while prancing around in my own raggedy, worn-out but slightly more fashionable hand-me-down, wriggling my skinny backside at her with a taunting chant of, "You look like a baby, you should wear a nappy," and any similar insults I could think of. Instead of ignoring me, a far better way to shut me up, she ran at me in a furious rage, hitting and scratching, but I was 3.5 years older and could skip out of her reach with ease, cackling and still goading her. "It's your turn to go in front," I told Delia. "It was my turn last time," she whined. "It's always me who has to go in front." With a lot of arguing, we were establishing who would have to wear Dad's gumboots and walk at the head of the line, wielding his favourite walking stick, which we'd appropriated without his permission. Dad was always annoyed if we borrowed his stick, as we usually forgot to return it because we'd abandoned it somewhere in the long grass to be lost forever. The sister who got to walk behind the leader was the most vulnerable. Grandpa had his own theory, and because he knew the most about snakes, we believed him implicitly. The first person wakes the snake up so that it's poised, angry, and ready to bite the second person, he had said benignly, his hands folded over his khaki-clad belly as he sat comfortably on our front veranda, his feet propped up on a footstool, having come over from Fort Nottingham for a morning cup of tea. The sister that walked second wielded a knobkerrie, a weapon mentioned before when we went hunting and bebas. The kiri, with its bulbous knob at the end of a 2-foot-long stick, was a favourite fighting weapon with Zulu men who used it ferociously against an opponent who defended himself with an ordinary stick and shield. The remaining 2 sisters could walk unimpeded and safely at the back. Dine thrust the stick and gumboots at Delia and gave her a shove. "Just get on with it," she said irritably, and aimed a kick at her littlest sister's costume-clad backside. "I'm sick of all this arguing." It always took a while to work out the pecking order, and on some occasions we ended up tackling each other, rolling into the grass and pinning each other down to be pummeled until someone gave in. Eventually, hot and bothered, we formed a strange procession down through the paddock, walking in single file in our bathing costumes, towels slung over our shoulders, and one of us carrying a lilo, with the sun sizzling the backs of our necks. The leader, in this case, Delia, clomped along with her skinny, long legs in gumboots, many sizes too big for her. She swished the walking stick viciously from side to side in front of her, making as much noise as she could through the long green summer grass. Snakes were a very real threat. Various types lay hidden in the grass, mainly puff adders, which in their lazy, sluggish way lay quite still, their yellowish scales with a distinctive chevron-shaped dark black bars creating a perfect camouflage on the sand in the shadow of the grass, until someone trod on one, when it struck with lightning speed, sinking its fangs into a foot and injecting its venom, destroying blood cells and causing extensive tissue damage around the twin fang punctures, usually on the lower leg. Puff adders bites are common and responsible for most snake bite fatalities. Death usually results from kidney failure and other complications caused by the extensive swelling. If the victim was lucky, the limb could be amputated and he would survive. Occasionally we would jump out of our skins when great big green grasshoppers with scarlet bellies and bright yellow legs leapt from the grass at our feet and flew off clumsily, their rustling wings clicking and whirring, to land with a thump in the grass a short distance away. Fork-tailed drongos sat on high perches on twigs in the wattle trees, their black wings flicking in anticipation, waiting to swoop hawk-like on the insects. There were other reptiles too, harmless grass snakes and basking lizard-like skinks on rocks, which gave us just as much of a fright as they slithered rapidly out of our way and into the long grass, making it rustle. More rarely, there were cobras, mainly the ringhouse, which would rear up to the height of a child, the hood spread and showing its distinctive mark of a hook when it spat a stream of poison into the eyes, temporarily blinding the victim before delivering a sometimes deadly bite. In spite of all these drawbacks, and having safely run the gauntlet, we arrived at our favourite swimming pool to lie and sunbathe on the huge, rounded, elephant-coloured granite boulders, every now and again slipping into the chilly, fast-running water to cool off. Now and again we were startled by the leguans, anything of up to 7 feet long, which liked to bask on the bank. These coal-black reptiles with their tough, glistening, leathery skins covered in tiny yellow spots jumped to their feet and raced for the water to disappear in a noisy splash. We knew there were no crocs this high in the mountains, but the croc-sized reptilians, lizards, so resembled those sinister creatures that instinctively the leader shrieked and ran back, stumbling and knocking over the girls behind her, causing panic and mayhem. When we'd collected our drop towels, sticks, and lilos, sometimes someone would say, "It's just a leguan, stupid," and we'd slide down the bank and onto our favourite rocks. There was a natural weir made by a ledge of rocks that lay across the river, a small shallow pool on one side and the big deep swimming pool below. Glorious dark blue wild agapanthus grew in profusion on the bank, among the rich green ferns and mosses, alongside the bright orange flowers of wild Mombrecia and crimson wild fuchsia. There were tall, red-hot pokers with their many tiny bubble-like scarlet flowers, and creamy white arum lilies leaned in towards their reflections in the water. We picked giant rhubarb-like leaves and put them upside down on our hair, where they shaded our heads from the scorching sun. And if we stood on rocks on the bottom of the pool, we had to keep moving, our feet otherwise big brown rivers crabs scuttled over to pinch our pink toes, hard enough for us to yelp and jump out of the water, cursing. This was a pleasant way to spend a morning, but tempers became frayed towards 1 o'clock, when we had to drag ourselves away, drunk with too much heat, feeling soporific, limp and lazy from overexposure to so much sun, and swimming drag on the hot, sweaty gumboots again. Hunt, usually unsuccessfully, for my father's walking stick where we'd thrown it into the long grass, and tramp wearily all the way up the hill at the very hottest time of the day. Caring less about the snakes by now, and resenting the broiling sun that bit into our already burnt shoulders, we trudged grumpily up, fought over whose turn it was to close the wire concertina gate, and stamped crossly up to the lawn to eat a hot meat and 2 veg lunch in the stifling nursery. My father refused to eat cold food, ever, So every day, Masango cooked a proper English farmhouse type of midday meal designed for a cold climate. We ate steak and kidney pie, cottage pie, stew, casserole, braised oxtail, liver, and even tripe and onions, all served up with mounds of boiled, roasted, or mashed potatoes, and 2 or 3 kinds of veg, whatever the baboons had left us. And all this despite the temperature outside being around 35 degrees Celsius. Rice pudding, bread and butter pudding, and sago were my father's favourites, so we got those as well. They reminded him of his 3 years he spent at Cambridge University. "The happiest days of my life," he'd often say, a comment which predictably made my mother react with an indignant, "What about when you met me?" He referred to salads as rabbit food and wouldn't even entertain the thought of having them on his plate. Our preferences didn't feature at all in my mother's life. As long as my father got what he wanted, nothing else mattered. So unwillingly we had to make do with what was put in front of us. Since my mother never went near the kitchen, it was up to Masango to collar her somewhere in a flower bed and ask her what he could cook for lunch that day. She would ask him what animal had been slaughtered on the farm that week and which cuts were available. Masango would suggest a meat dish, and that was that. My mother could then concentrate on her priorities again. All our food came from the farm, except for commodities such as rice, flour, tea, coffee, salt, and spices like pepper and curry powder. My mother also had to buy cheese, as the climate was too hot to make it in our dairy, although we had an endless supply of fresh milk, cream, and butter from our cows. Commodities like sugar and mealie meal came in great big sacks from the Nottingham Road railway station and were heavily subsidised by the nationalist government, who were very generous towards the farmers and treated us very well. After lunch, which we picked at disinterestedly, it was no wonder we were all so skinny. We preferred to glean wild berries from the bush, having established that these were the same kind as the vervet monkeys and our baboons ate, or swipe a hunk of Masango's homemade bread from the kitchen while he was taking his lunch break back at his hut. We had to stay out of earshot until 4, which was when my father woke up from his afternoon rest for a cup of tea on the front veranda. Once the day had cooled off a bit, and the mountains and gums were starting to cast a shadow over the garden. My sisters and I emerged from our bedrooms, our short hair pillow-tousled, and our faces damp with perspiration and flushed pink from the morning's exposure to the sun, and wandered aimlessly through the house. My mother called from her cane armchair on the front veranda, "It's cool enough for a game of tennis," while we mooched along inside in the cool house past the sitting room window. She was leaning forward, pouring out 2 cups of tea from the silver teapot, one of them for my father, who sat in the other chair which faced the garden and had the best view of the bush. He had his leather slippered feet up on the matching footstool and was reading the sports section of a 2-day-old newspaper. His binoculars lay on the small glass-topped cane table next to him. The prospect of tennis seemed quite attractive until I padded barefoot to the edge of the veranda steps and peered down at the grass court. "Where's the net?" I asked. "I got Jamela to take it down because it looked like there was going to be a storm this afternoon, but I think it's passed over now. The net's in the garage. You can put it up again," said my mother. I replied, "I'll only put it up if the others help. It's heavy to carry down, and we need 2 people to string it up." I added this pointedly, looking around at the others who had collapsed into soft chairs on the veranda and were looking distinctly unenthusiastic. We'd had such a fight the last time we'd attempted to set up a game of tennis. The whole affair had ended with Delia stomping off back to the slope of the house, crying, and threatening to tell our mother on us, and Dine and I hurling tennis balls and the wooden rackets at each other's heads, and finally trying to strangle one another with a net, which had only got as far as being dragged halfway down to the lawn to the court itself. "I just don't why I bother with you lot," Mum had shouted at us as we trickled back to the house, one by one, red-faced, tear-stained and vindictive. I was Eastern Province Juniors tennis champion when I was your age, and I used to practice every day with my cousins. All you girls do is fight and squabble. I'm sick of the lot of you." I said, "What about a ride? It's cool enough for a short one, to the top of the bush." Diane had slumped a little further down into the cushions of her chair and poked moodily at the wicker coffee table with her bare foot. "All the polo ponies are out on the grass. They'll be miles away." Her voice almost rose, but not quite, to a whine. "It'll take us ages." "Your own ponies are in the pigsty field," snapped my father irritably. He had quite enough of the whinging and wanted us off the veranda. There was nothing he hated more than seeing his daughters hanging around doing nothing, and the very signs of our squabbling had already driven him into another one of his rages. "Go and saddle them up and take them out. They've all got great big grass bellies on them, so they need the exercise. Now!" And with a final snap of the page, he returned to his paper. Nicolette, Diane and I slunk off quickly to the tack room to collect the bridles, leaving Delia to curl up with a comic in the cushions of the chair I just vacated. She had never liked riding, especially after the debacle where she fell off Sonny and broke her arm, all of which was apparently my fault. I said gloomily, "Mine's going to be a bugger to catch. He always runs off at the last moment when he sees me. Bring his bridle out from behind my back. I'll have to use bait." On our way to the pigsty field, I paused at the Dutch apple tree, brought up from the Cape and planted by my grandmother, and snapped off for a couple of the hard, russet-coloured little apples that grew on it, in profusion in the early summer. It would be a matter of days before they ripened sufficiently for the baboons to grab the lot. I took a crunching bite out of one. It was crisp and sweet, but rock hard, and I spat the mouthful out again onto the grass. This will be perfect. We stood at the gate and called, holding the apples out temptingly as each pony appeared from over the far side of the big field where they'd been grazing on the lush, knee-high kikuyu grass, and walked towards us, ears pricked forward with interest. Chanter, Dad's newest polo pony, arrived first. He had just acquired her and was going to start schooling her for the winter polo season in the autumn, when it was cool enough for him to do so. Diane had a fat dun pony called Pat, and mine was Squib, a misnomer if ever I came across one. Skib was a Basutu pony, a hairy barrel on 4 stubborn legs. He had pigeon toes, knock knees, and a bottom lip that stuck out permanently, giving him a mullish, half-baked look, and he had a temperament to match. "I'm not bothering with the saddle," I called to the others as I swung myself onto Squib's dusty, spotted back. Technically he was a bay, but he had tiny patches of white hair like speckles all over him, his back and rump, which gave him a flea-bitten look, and I dug my bare heels into his hairy ribs, causing him to flatten his ears mutinously and tuck his tail into his rump. He refused to budge, so I collected up my reins in one hand, and using my spare dangling piece as a flat leather crop, I slapped him hard on his shaggy neck, raising a puff of dust. The effect was spectacular, as he bunched up his backside and sprang forwards from standing into a canter. He kept up this gait for a minute or so, then it fizzled out into such a half-hearted, reluctant jog that I had to keep drumming my heels on his rounded grass belly to keep him moving forward at all. Riding Squib was hard work. I yelled over my shoulder, "I'll meet you at the stables," as the other two led their ponies more decorously up the dirt track to saddle up. It was a glorious afternoon, and the three of us clattered down the district road at a trot, sending up a cloud of red dust. We turned in at the brick field. This was so called because that's where Grandpa had found the right kind of clay to mix with straw to make the bricks with which we had our house built. We struggled with the barbed wire gate, which fought back and clawed our bare, sunburnt arms as we wrestled it shut again, and then coaxed the ponies to a full gallop up the long grassy slope to the top of the hill that overlooked the house. As we thundered up the incline, Squib puffing laboriously behind the others, we startled a pair of bushbuck that had been sleeping away the heat of the day in the long, cool felt grass. The two dark brown antelope with their beautiful paler rippled vertical stripes and distinctive white spots on their flanks jumped to their feet, alarming Dine's pony, who snorted and tossed his head, flecking her shirt with white specks of foam from his bit. Both buck bounded away gracefully, the regal bull angling his long corkscrewed horns along his yellowish crest of hair on his back. As with consummate ease they cleared the fence that stood on the brow of the hill between the field and the dense forest, to evaporate into the bush as if by magic. We drew our winded mounts to a standstill on the brow of the hill, where a cool breeze ruffled our hair and gently lifted our ponies' manes to let them regain their breath. Their sides heaved from the exertion of their gallop, and lathers of sweat had formed under their girths and brow bands. I said, "Hey, look at that!" and I pointed across the valley. There, on the other side of Inchlasela Peak, were some grey specks that looked like rocks, except they were moving slowly up the mountainside. "It's the baboons," said Dine. "They're making their way up to their sleeping place." We sat on our ponies and watched the 80-strong troop climb up to their favourite cliff face, where they all huddled together at night, sleeping perched precariously on little ledges on the precipice, safely out of the reach of our resident leopards. The sun had already set behind the mountains. There was still about half an hour before nightfall, and the baboons had a leisurely air about them as they picked their way up the steep slope, stopping every now and again to turn over a rock, looking for insects underneath, or forage in the long grass. The little ones, typical of youngsters everywhere, had acquired a pre-bedtime burst of extra energy, and were gambolling among the rocks, pouncing on one another, bowling each other over, so that they rolled quite a distance back down the steep incline, only to jump back up again and bounce spring-legged up the hillside. Nicolette said, "Come on, it'll be dark soon. We'd better get back." And we turned our ponies' heads towards home and jogged back along the fence line until we reached the gate to the road. "Phew! You stink of horse sweat," was our mother's only greeting, wrinkling her nose as we traipsed back into the house after releasing the ponies back into their paddocks. You'd better go and have your baths now, and get into your pyjamas before supper." And that's the end of the latest article by Fee.